The hermeneutic project of Hans-Georg Gadamer has been one of the most important and influential intellectual trends in post-World War II high culture. What he's attempted to do is find a sort of set of unifying principles which connects the soft sciences and which allows us to get outside the reigning paradigms of historicism and positivism, which he thought threatened the tradition of Western philosophy. Now, Gadamer intends, in his hermeneutic project, to unify the soft sciences with the intention of bringing the person who is adopting this hermeneutic perspective into what's called Wirkungsgeschichtliches Bewusstsein. What that is, it translates into English as historical affective consciousness or affective historical consciousness. The idea is that it brings the person to a level of understanding or comprehension which is not entirely consistent or doesn't perfectly overlap the idea of reason, univocal reason. So, Wirkungsgeschichtliches Bewusstsein, effective historical consciousness, might be described as a sense of tact, a sense of proportion, good judgment, or we might call it what Aristotle called it, which is phronesis. Aristotle uses the idea of phronesis, judgment, to refer to those kinds of knowledge which are not entirely univocal, which are not entirely formulaic in their orientation, and yet which are rule-governed. The rules that govern the disciplines which entail phronesis are fuzzy rules, are slippery rules, are not the precisely defined rules that we get in things like geometry. So what Gadamer is trying to drive us towards is what we might call wisdom rather than knowledge, judgment rather than certainty, a sense of proportion rather than a mathematical certainty. Taste, tact, common sense are all connected together in this idea of effective historical consciousness. And this is the sort of thing, or this is the end that Gadamer thinks that learning serves, or that thinking serves. So because positivism and historicism tend to undermine this sense of phronesis, this sense of judgment or wisdom, what Gadamer wants to do is go back and reevaluate the theory of knowledge, see where positivism and historicism went wrong, and try and put Western philosophy back on the right track. So what he's hoping to do is connect individuals, the persons that get this effective historical consciousness, to enlarge their horizon of thought, enlarge their horizon, the domain of their experiences, and then connect their individual horizon up with the overall general collective horizon of the culture as a whole. The horizon, and he uses that term explicitly, the horizon of a person or of a culture is constructed in language, is constructed within the domain of their symbol system, and as a result, what Gadamer offers us is a general way of thinking about the way people think about symbols, the way people think about the world that is not composed of objects. This entails interpretation, and what Gadamer wishes to do is give us a theory of interpretation which allows us to connect the various soft sciences to establish and take seriously the truth of the soft sciences, and then to ask us what sort of knowledge we can get access to independent of methodological formalism. So what he wants to do is break through the formulaic conception of knowledge that comes out of positivism and move on towards a more general encyclopedic conception of knowledge, very much like that of Aristotle. Okay. Now, the intellectual sources of Gadamer are very, very wide, and this should not be surprising because most of his intellectual project involves the careful reappropriation of cultural traditions, but altering these cultural traditions so that they are consistent with the changes in the overall gestalt of knowledge that is a product of historical development. So Gadamer is in some ways caught between relativism and absolutism. He likes the idea that knowledge is relative to its historical context and historical time, but he doesn't take it the entire way so that we get the idea that the fact that knowledge is contingent means that it is entirely relative. At different points in historical time, there are different ways of encyclopedically organizing the cultural traditions that go up to that period of time, and this is an ongoing process. So he's something like Aristotle in the following sense. Aristotle holds, for example, that there are rules for constructing tragedies, if you've read the Poetics. And he agrees that while aesthetic appreciation is in some sense subjective, it is not entirely subjective because there are actually objective rules for things like the construction of tragedies. Well, what Gadamer thinks is that there are something like those objective rules for the interpretation not just of tragedy, but for whole domains of intellectual discourse. And so what he's doing is trying to avoid the relativism and subjectivism that comes from taking history and aesthetics seriously, and at the same time not diminish the domain of knowledge so that it applies exclusively to the realm of history and nature. So what he's looking to is to find a way between the two poles, between the rock and the hard place of contemporary thought. And for that reason, he's been extremely influential and very fertile in his suggestions for further research. And I'll try and discuss some of those at length. But let's go back all the way to the source. The source of Gadamer is very clearly Aristotle. If you think of what Aristotle's approach to philosophy was, the encyclopedic reach, the tendency to emphasize intellectual flexibility when evaluating different sorts of discourse, and most importantly, the idea of phronesis itself. Aristotle was the one who said, "It is the mark of an educated man not to demand more precision from a subject than it can possibly give. We do not allow for approximate geometry, and we do not usually allow for deductive certainty in aesthetics. Rather, we move from one domain to another using different sort of hermeneutic principles, different sorts of grounds for our evaluation. These grounds for evaluation may change over time, and yet it does allow us a certain degree of knowledge which is independent of relativism, independent of subjectivity when we apprehend these rules." So Aristotle's phronesis, the idea of encyclopedism, and also the sense of proportion that is remarkable in Aristotle is also found in Gadamer. One of the facts about contemporary thinkers is that they, for the most part, tend to take one idea as far in an extreme as they can. If you see Foucault taking postmodernism or Levi-Strauss taking structuralism, they take one idea and see how far you can extend that idea before it breaks down and before you engender certain contradictions. Gadamer is very opposite to that tendency. He is looking to make a reconciliation between all the competing domains of knowledge so that he can completely absorb the entire cultural tradition of the West and offer us a new sort of encyclopedia in the sense of a circle of knowledge, which moves right around the domains and doesn't feel that its job is the delegitimation of most of what counts as knowledge. If you think of what positivists typically do, they set up a Procrustean theory of knowledge and then use it to judge aesthetics or ethics or theology very harshly. Gadamer wants to do the opposite. He wants to inquire into natural science, find its mechanisms of operation, do an interpretation of that both historically and logically, but then also move on to the other domains of knowledge like aesthetics, psychoanalysis, literary criticism, history, and inquire from the inside what the domain is, what its principles of interpretation are, and then find principles which connect the various domains of knowledge so that he can form one encyclopedic stance towards the contemporary world of knowledge. Now, the idea of a hermeneutics is most interesting. Hermeneutics might be defined as the science of interpretation. Now, here we have to be very careful about the difference between German and English. In German, the idea of a science is a Wissenschaft, right, an organized body of knowledge or statements, whereas in English, the domain of knowledge of science is more truncated. It refers almost exclusively to natural science. Usually when we in English talk about science, we're talking about physics or chemistry or biology or something like that. In German, when they talk about science, they use the word Wissenschaft and they just mean an organized body of knowledge, which allows in the domain of physics, but also includes things like theology, literary criticism, right? So their domain of science is larger. In the sense that science is a Wissenschaft, an organized body of knowledge, Gadamer wants to offer us a theory of interpretation, a way of thinking about interpretation itself that will move from one domain to another. In other words, he wishes to point out certain commonalities about interpretation that apply, for example, to the interpretation of literature by a literary critic, to the interpretation of a patient's statements in the case of a psychoanalyst, to the case of an actor interpreting someone like Hamlet or King Lear, to the case of say, a literary writer like Joyce interpreting the Western tradition and then accommodating it and bringing it into his own work. The idea then is that there's something about interpretation that holds it together. And what Gadamer has searched for and perhaps found is the skeleton key to interpretation. What is it that makes all interpretations either successful or unsuccessful, desirable or undesirable? So what he wants to do then, what he thinks he's done, is found a way of drawing a big circle around the entire domain of knowledge based upon this conception of interpretation. This is derived in part from Schleiermacher. It's not, by itself, it's not a new idea, this hermeneutics, this science of interpretation. In the early 19th century, Germans were working on particularly two problems: the interpretation of legal texts and the interpretation of biblical texts. And one of the results of Schleiermacher's observations and his researches is to show that there are certain fundamental continuities between the interpretation of law and the interpretation of Scripture. This unexpected continuity suggested that perhaps this domain of hermeneutics could be extended, and once we extend it from legal text to biblical text, it might be extended to all texts, and then when we're finished extending it to the entire domain of text, we may reevaluate the question of text and find out that things like paintings, bridges, or various kinds of architecture, statues, are all texts in a way. In other words, hermeneutics turns out to be the skeleton key to investigating the human world as opposed to the natural world. So this is going to be very important, and it's a very big, ambitious project that he's undertaking and borrowing from Schleiermacher. Now, another borrowing that Gadamer makes is from Schopenhauer and Kant and the tradition of German aesthetics, particularly the idea that aesthetic apprehension is not entirely relativistic or subjective. If you think of Kant's critique of judgment, or if you think of Schopenhauer's conception of the artist as being perfectly objective and aesthetic apprehension as being participation in that objectivity of the artist, he wants to pick up that idea. Gadamer wants to say, yes, there is a truth in art. There is something we find out through art that is not formulaic, that is not subject to precisely definable rules, and this gives the lie to positivism. This gives the lie to naturalism. This gives the lie to all the claims which want to restrict knowledge to the domain of human understanding of the physical world. In fact, we do understand the physical world as a sort of secondary proposition, but our first and immediate apprehensions are of the human world, the world of signs, the world of symbols, and the world of communication. So what he's trying to do is say that that art contradicts any positivistic claim. That is, say, the first time you read something like the complete works of Shakespeare, you learn something from it unless you're a complete dunderhead. If you do learn something from it, then you have a good question to ask someone like Carnap. How is it possible that there can be knowledge that I get from Shakespeare, but there's no method for it? How is it that I'm not following, say, Popper's idea of the hypothetical deductive method? How is it possible for me to get knowledge? It seems that they're forced to tell you that Shakespeare can't teach you anything, and that's just a lie. If they're going to concede that you learn things from Shakespeare, or from Titian, or from any great artist, if they're going to concede the point that you learn something from art, then we must ask some very serious and pointed questions. What do you learn, and how do you learn it? You sure don't learn it through any sort of precise scientific method. As a matter of fact, Gadamer has doubts about the existence of a unitary scientific method. He's borrowed a couple of pages from the books of people like Kuhn or Feyerabend or Rorty or any of those who doubt the idea that science is held together by anything but its pragmatic results. So what Gadamer is doing is saying we're going to have to look at other non-methodical kinds of knowledge, account for them, and then he's going to create a big circle around the methodical knowledges and the non-methodical knowledges based upon this idea of hermeneutics and transparency of interpretation. So he is clearly appropriating tremendous chunks of the German and Western intellectual tradition, but twisting them and using them to his own purposes. So his activity is an example of this effective historical consciousness, which borrows, takes from the past, transforms and accommodates the past, and then uses it for effective historical purposes today. And his effective historical purpose is to give us an example of a new way of thinking about knowledge, which goes beyond historicism and positivism. It's a very ambitious undertaking. Now, another important source for Gadamer is Dilthey. Dilthey was a late 19th century German writer who emphasized the idea that there were two kinds of knowledge. He works with a guy named Windelband when he works this out, but there are two kinds of knowledge according to Windelband and Dilthey. And what they say is that one knowledge generates what he calls nomothetic results. Nomothetic means creation of laws. So something like physics, F equals ma, there's a nomothetic result. We see things moving around and then we talk about their force and their acceleration and we come up with F equals ma. An alternative kind of thinking is what he calls ideographic, something that generates pictures or images, and the hermeneutic sciences, the soft sciences, are ideographic in this sense. There's a big dual distinction between our knowledge of the external world, which is nomothetic, and our knowledge of the internal world, of the psyche, or the internal world of cultural symbolism, that we know in a different way from the way we know natural science. And what he says is that these ideographic disciplines require Verstehen instead of Vernunft. Vernunft is the German idea of reason, or the German term for reason, but Verstehen is the German word for understanding. And what we do when we understand something is understand it from the perspective of a human being. In other words, the things that are the objects of Vernunft are the things that we would have a hard time explaining to a Martian. On the other hand, the things that are the products of or the things that are the product of Verstehen, we'd have a hard time explaining to a Martian. The things that are the product of Vernunft, we could explain to any rational being. We could explain arithmetic to a Martian, but it might be very hard to explain, for example, Oedipus Rex to a Martian. Right? One involves viewing things from the perspective of a human being. The other involves disembodied rationality. What Gadamer wants to emphasize is this activity of interpreting things from the perspective of a human being, rather than this alleged disembodied rationality. From Husserl, Gadamer borrows two basic ideas. First, the idea that we should have a phenomenological investigation of the domain of knowledge. In other words, we should view it from the eyes of a human being, from the inside, as it appears directly to humans. And second, that the big targets, the real danger and the fragmenting tendencies in the 20th century come from positivism and historicism. So Husserl's idea of the life world, approaching knowledge as it appears to a human being, embedded in a concrete historical context, that's the important thing for him. And this all leads up to Gadamer's teacher, and this makes all the difference in the world. Heidegger was Gadamer's teacher, and Dasein is what Gadamer's hermeneutics is all about. In other words, Heidegger introduces into Western philosophy the idea of Dasein, that being and time, temporality and human existence are inextricably bound up, that language is caught up with being, and that being only exists in language. There's some sort of an overlap between the two. And the final idea that he offers is what Heidegger calls the hermeneutic circle, which I'll raise later on when I talk about the specifics of Gadamer's project. But the key thing that Gadamer borrows from Heidegger is this idea of temporality. Temporality is essential to Dasein, to the human condition, and this will have a formative, determinative effect on the products of human knowledge. You can think of it this way. Hermeneutics for Gadamer is the conscious response of human beings confronting, or perhaps even constructing, the universe around them. Right? The domain of being and the human world is contained within the realm of language, and what Gadamer wants to do is give us a way of interpreting various linguistic, and this is linguistic in the large sense, gestures. Now, two things are going to emerge in his connection with Heidegger. We'll show off the project of hermeneutics at some advantage. In the first, Dasein, the idea that we have to that Heidegger gives of direct human experience, means that we have to live in temporality. And one of the results of that is that we are constantly, because of the movement of time, constantly alienated from cultural traditions. In other words, the cultural traditions of last year have altered slightly, and we have moved away from them slightly. In other words, there's a line, I believe, in Goethe's Faust where he says, if you would inherit from your forefathers, you must win it again anew. Well, what he is saying essentially is that if we wish to inherit the cultural traditions from our forefathers, we must earn them ourselves anew. So, because human beings live in temporality, if they wish to extend the horizon of their understanding so that it is consistent and so that it extends beyond its truncated domain to the horizon of the culture as a whole, what they must do is constantly reinvent the cultural tradition, reabsorb it, reinterpret it, and this process of reinterpretation is what keeps it alive. All right? So this process of cultural interpretation means that is a function of the fact that we live in Dasein, and Dasein entails temporality, and temporality means that we are constantly being re-alienated from our cultural tradition. I read Plato when I was 20, I read Aristotle when I was 25, but if I want to go back and reclaim Aristotle and Plato, I must read it again and reabsorb Aristotle and Plato based upon the changes in my knowledge, based upon the changes in society as a whole, based upon our new thinking about Aristotle and Plato. It's not an accident that Gadamer is one of the leading interpreters of both Aristotle and Plato, has done both deep translations and great hermeneutic interpretations, particularly of the ancients. So he's not only giving us a general schema by which to go back and reclaim a cultural tradition, which doesn't do violence to non-scientific activities, he's also giving us an example of that reclaiming of a cultural tradition, because that's what this book is. So it instantiates the methodological preferences that it suggests. So it works on at least two levels, and that's one of the most important and interesting achievements of Gadamer's work. So you could say then that hermeneutics is the attempt to overcome this constant alienation from our cultural tradition. And the way we do that is by reabsorbing and reutilizing and reappropriating this tradition. And that process is what holds all of knowledge together. Now what this seems to entail, and this is one of the criticisms that's been leveled at Gadamer, what this seems to entail is a rebuilding or a reconstruction or recreation of Hegelianism. It would seem that at each generation, at each level of historical development, we are called upon to, or each generation is called upon to reinterpret, reabsorb, and reappropriate the previous cultural tradition. And yet, it's hard to make Hegelianism a serious philosophical alternative nowadays because of all the Procrustean teleology, all the metaphysics that comes with it. That's really hard to persuade people with in this day and age. I think the argument would be something like this, that what Gadamer forces us to or directs us towards is something what I would call a soft form of Hegelianism that leaves off the more extreme claims made by Hegel. I would be inclined to say that Gadamer's view is a sort of weak form of the Hegelian progress of the Geist. The culture progresses not towards some eschaton, some final stage of history where the world ends and we finally reconcile with God. Rather, I think that Gadamer has us progressing not toward some eschaton, but away from our condition of permanent alienation from the culture. In other words, the human condition is such that Dasein requires that we live in temporality. Temporality necessarily continually excludes us and divorces us and alienates us from culture. We progress when we manage to complete the hermeneutic circle and go back to our cultural orientation and undo that alienation. So instead of progress towards something, in Gadamer I think we get progress away from something. And that's actually a much smaller, more local claim. It's a lot easier to make that argument. So I think that there is a certain Hegelian element here, but I don't think he takes it quite as far as Hegel would have preferred. Now, let's examine, and given all of these strictures, let's examine Truth and Method, which is Gadamer's greatest work. It was published in 1960, and it was a reaction to the dominant schools of thought, particularly positivism and historicism. And at the end of the book, what he tries to do is, having undermined both, establish this new discipline of hermeneutics. And you could almost call his book Truth or Method, because at the time that he was writing, methodological concerns, particularly the methodology of science, was a central issue for philosophers. And the hope of the positivists, at least, was that once we had established beyond question the method of the natural sciences, then the results of the natural sciences would not be in doubt, and we could move on towards the idea of a unified science, you know, the great kind of a chimera of positivism. And what Gadamer is saying is that it may be a choice between truth or method. Perhaps there is some truth that we derive from things like the scientific method, if there is some such a thing, but he's trying to show, using the example of art, that there are clearly examples of knowledge that we get independent of method. So he is almost saying, perhaps we can get some truth out of methods, but mostly the important truths are the non-formulaic ones, the hermeneutic truths that we get independent of method. All right, so he's going to ask, how can we step outside of method? And when we step outside of method and we're still in the domain of truth, how do we get there? What is it to be there? And how are we going to account for all this? So what he's trying to do is something like this. If you think of Wittgenstein's program after the end of the Second World War when he's writing the Investigations, he's trying to show that positivism and the language game of natural science is just one language game among many, in an infinite variety of language games, and that natural scientific discourse doesn't have any special pride of place. Well, in some respects, that's what Gadamer is doing in Truth and Method. He's not rejecting science entirely, he's just saying that it doesn't get any special pride of place. It has its own internal rules, and within its domain it's just fine, but when positivists make the exaggerated claims that all of knowledge is physics, they go beyond what they can possibly support. And his great counterexample is the truth that we get from aesthetics. All right, there are three sections to Truth and Method. The first is devoted to art. And what he's the key thing for art and aesthetics, as far as Gadamer is concerned, is that this discloses a human truth which is undeniable. He says, in good faith, even a positivist can't tell you don't learn things from Shakespeare. Even a positivist can't have the nerve to tell you that art doesn't disclose any information about the human world to you. The problem is that it doesn't disclose information. It doesn't let you know things on the basis of some formula. Right? It isn't necessarily univocal. So here's where he brings in Kant and Schopenhauer on the objectivity of aesthetics. And he also emphasizes the idea that play and recreation is connected with the idea of representation. And all of these ideas are subsumed under the idea of a language game. In other words, for Gadamer, the idea of art as a whole is ludic in the sense that it refers to games and play. And for Gadamer as a whole, what he's going to end up doing is collapsing the distinction between play, representation, and presentation so that he gets a system of overlapping local language games which have certain similarities but no unifying ultimate similarity which allows us to choose between them. So in other words, it's a big tent like Aristotle gives us in Gadamer's conception of knowledge. Now, the point of our aesthetic activities is the apprehension and appropriation of cultural traditions like tragedy and literature. And here's where he introduces a very interesting and important idea, one that I have found very fruitful in my own teaching and working. It's the idea of transparency. It's a very interesting thought. How do we know when an interpretation is a good one? Because I think commonsensically, if you've ever talked to a psychoanalyst or a literary critic or maybe a dramatic director or a dramatic actor, all of them are interpreting texts or all of them are doing some sort of interpretive activity. How do you know when an interpretation is a good one? I assume commonsensically that we have encountered good interpretations and bad interpretations. How do we know which are which, and how do we move from one genre of interpretation of another? In other words, is there anything which makes similar the interpretation of Hamlet that we get from an actor and the interpretation of Hamlet that we might get from a director? Both are interpreting. Well, what Gadamer says is, yes, there is something that holds these together, and this is the idea of transparency of apprehension. In other words, you finally have a good interpretation, or an interpretation is good, or successful, or adequate insofar as you no longer see or hear the interpreter. In other words, what makes, I don't know if any of you know classical music, but what makes Vladimir Horowitz a wonderful romantic pianist who covers, I don't know, Schubert and Schumann and all those romantic musicians beautifully? Because when he plays, his playing is transparent. When he sits down to the keyboard, you don't hear Vladimir Horowitz. You hear Beethoven or Schubert. When you now compare a very fine pianist to a beginning piano student that's making all kinds of mistakes and generating all sorts of sour notes, when you listen to that, the reason why it gets on your nerves is because you're not hearing Beethoven. It's a bad interpretation. You're not hearing Schubert. It's a bad interpretation. What you're hearing is the poor student of the piano. That's what makes their interpretation a weak one, because you're hearing them rather than the music. Now let's move from that idea to extending it into all domains of interpretation. You have, for example, a good interpretation of Hamlet when you see Laurence Olivier in form, but what you hear is Hamlet. In other words, when you no longer see the actor, but you only see the person who's allegedly on stage, or the person that's being represented, then you know how you have a transparent interpretation. Think about the interpretation that would be offered to Hamlet by a director. I mean, they'll have to decide things like blocking and lighting and timing and the way in which lines are delivered and the way in which the space of the theater is organized. Well, Gadamer would argue, and I think this is a very deep thought, that what would make for a successful or good or desirable interpretation of Hamlet was a director interpreting that in such a way so that we saw Hamlet rather than Joseph Papp. Makes a certain amount of sense. Insofar as you see the artist or the interpreter, then the interpretation is not a good one, right? It's opaque rather than transparent. Insofar as you see the thing being represented rather than the representer, then you have a transparent interpretation, and that is what makes for good or desirable interpretation. All right? So look at the advantages. I mean, commonsensically, there's a great deal of truth in this. When we listen to the beginning piano student, what we hear are their terrible, egregious mistakes, and we do not like that interpretation of Beethoven. On the other hand, when we hear the accomplished pianist, the reason we may like the interpretation is because what we are hearing is the music. What we like about certain interpretations of Hamlet is that we get to see the play. It discloses the play to us rather than the intention of the actor or the director. All right? So this idea of interpretation and transparency of interpretation carries him an awful long way. And this can be taken beyond the domain exclusively of art. Let's see if we can get this a little further. It includes things like the plastic arts and the literary arts, but think of something like psychoanalysis. Well, when a psychoanalyst interprets the speech of an analysand, all right, you know that you have a good psychoanalyst when you hear your own thoughts, or when you hear the thoughts of some third person of the analysand, rather than a Procrustean formulation of the thoughts of the analysand, which shows an opacity of interpretation on the part of the psychoanalyst. In other words, psychoanalysis, literary criticism, are both rule-governed behaviors which interpret not the natural world but the world of signs and symbols. They do so on the basis of schools of thought, and we know we have a good interpretation within these schools of thought when we get transparency, when we see the thing being interpreted. This is a very deep thought, and he has found a sort of bones or a sort of vertebrae, a sort of skeleton to interpretation, which had been previously thought invertebrate. Do you see the advantages to this? So what he's doing is finding something between the absolute univocal certainty of say, arithmetic, and the infinite variety of mere questions of taste, showing that there are certain, what I would call, slippery or fuzzy rules which govern this sort of a discourse, which govern all the soft sciences, and that doesn't make them less rule-oriented, and it doesn't make them less legitimate knowledge for that purpose. Think of the differences when we get to historicism. In other words, if scientism is the idea that knowledge is, or positivism is the idea that knowledge is exclusively truncated and limited to the domain of physics, historicism will allow that there might be an elaborate and very extensive domain of human knowledge, but that it's entirely relative. In other words, this is the flip side of the coin. One goes for certainty, but only allows certainty, positivism, within a domain of a very limited sets of discourse. The other alternative goes for skepticism, doesn't go for certainty, but it includes all of human activity. Historicism, here I'm thinking of somebody like Dilthey, or most of the late 19th century German thinkers are wrapped up in the idea of historical change and the incommensurability of historical projects. Well, what hermeneutics wishes to do, what Gadamer wishes to do, is to call that into question, saying, look, think about the interpretation of Oedipus back in the time of the ancient Greeks, and think of the interpretation of Oedipus now. Although there are many changes between us and then, and doubtless our interpretation of Oedipus may have a great deal, may have to deal with a great many other texts that have come to influence us since. For example, our staging of Oedipus may have to have some sort of connection with Freud. We may have to emphasize the Oedipal, literally the sexual feelings for the mother, in our interpretation of Freud, or our interpretation of Oedipus, that may not have been entirely necessary 2,500 years ago. But nonetheless, there still are certain facts about the Oedipus drama that must come through any interpretation if it is to be a successful or satisfactory or transparent interpretation. So in other words, our interpretation nowadays of Oedipus, in order to be successful and transparent and satisfactory, will have to emphasize the Oedipal drama and the sexual desire for the mother and the hatred of the father. And it will have to include a great many other things that have been added to our culture that inform and deepen and enrichen the Oedipus drama. But there will be some sort of necessary continuity between a successful interpretation of Oedipus today and a successful interpretation of Oedipus 2,500 years ago, because it is alleged to be disclosing some ultimate fact about human life. You cannot ignore that fact. If we do, either then or now, we have an opaque interpretation, a bad interpretation. And it seems then that he has found a sort of skeleton key, not just to the interpretation of works of art, but to the interpretation of the whole human domain. And it allows for historical change, it allows for enrichment, increasing depth, and increasing complexity. And yet within this complexity, he finds a string which leads us through the labyrinth, and the string which leads us through is this transparency of hermeneutic interpretation. This is a very deep project, and I mean, it's a very impressive piece of work. Now, the result that he wishes to bring us to, this effective historical consciousness, will be a hermeneutics guided by language. And what we will do if we adopt this perspective is make an ontological shift in our concerns from nature to man, and from object to subject. This corresponds to the move from Vernunft to Verstehen, from reason to understanding, from looking at the world from the outside to contemplating it from the inside. We might think of this in some ways as being analogous to what I'll call soft and hard rules. A hard rule is something like a grammatical rule. For example, every English sentence has to have a verb in it. There's no doubt about that. If it wants to be an English sentence, it has to have a verb in it. There's no exceptions to the rule. Think about another rule which is equally real but much fuzzier, much more slippery. Think about the rule that I often tell my students when I'm teaching them to write their compositions, that a good essay should be broken up into paragraphs. I mean, all of you know that, one would hope, right? There's a rule for paragraphing. But the rule for the construction of grammatical sentences, which tells us that every sentence must have a verb, is much more precise and well-defined than the rule for paragraphs. Now, I think it would be a mistake for us to say, well, then if it's not a well-defined rule, it really isn't a rule. I will mark down any paper that doesn't have paragraphs in it. On the other hand, if called upon to state specifically and precisely in the sense that grammar is stated, what exactly is the rule for paragraphing, I got to admit, it's a fuzzy rule, it's a soft rule, it's a slippery rule. Doesn't define as precisely as grammatical or arithmetic rules. Well, you might want to say then that hermeneutics, this hermeneutics that's guided by language, is a science of soft rules, which says don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. All rules aren't hard. That's the big mistake of positivism. Don't think that soft rules aren't really a kind of knowledge. That's the mistake of historicism. That just means that at night all cows are black. So what he's trying to give us is this conception of soft rules and to make us a little more sophisticated about our own language. See, one of the results of Wirkungsgeschichtliches Bewusstsein, of Gadamer's particular hermeneutic stance towards the world, is that it makes you a little bit dicey, a little bit suspicious about your own language and about your own concepts. It tells you, look, everybody else has been biased, influenced by their cultural traditions. You must be too. So although you can't avoid the burden or the charge of absorbing your cultural traditions, you must be a little suspicious, a little thoughtful about the way in which you do that. And the way in which he wants to do it is by going back and looking at the way in which we acquire this historical horizon, the way in which we appropriate these historical traditions. And what we're going to do is use language to understand the fact that language itself is historically conditioned, and that this historical conditioning distorts interpretation, and that's not a problem. That's just the human condition. That's part of Dasein. So you acknowledge for that, you make the best allowances that you can, and then you go back to the question. And so in other words, what emerges is a sort of dialectical relationship between a text or the whole domain of human culture. We go into that with certain expectations, and eventually we find these expectations thwarted. When our expectations are thwarted, we renew our interpretation. We come back, we create a new set of expectations, and we carry those around and examine the text of the world or the text of culture. It gets thwarted eventually. We come back and we renew our interpretation. This is called the hermeneutic circle. It is the logic of question and answer. It goes on forever. We interrogate our culture. We get a set of answers. When we get a new or novel or surprising answer, we have to reformulate our questions, reformulate our background knowledge, and then go back to work again. All right? So the hermeneutic circle is not a vicious circle. It is simply the human condition when we interrogate the realm of human symbols as opposed to knowledge, when that becomes or the realm of human symbols as opposed to nature, when that becomes our primary concern in thinking. So what, in the last part of Truth and Method, what Gadamer does, which is a very impressive idea, is not only does he show us that we have reason to be a little bit suspicious of our own cultural traditions, a little bit suspicious of our own linguistic inheritances, then the thing that he does is he gives us a history of the concept of language itself. He says, fine, I'm going to appropriate the Western cultural tradition. He goes back to Plato, goes back to Aristotle, works on their concept of the logos, and then writes us a small history of the concept of the logos, of language, that starts with the Greeks, moves through Thomas Aquinas and Scholasticism, comes right up to Hans-Georg Gadamer. And he says, this is where it goes to. What an incredible intellectual tour de force. And it's the opposite of the snake eating its own tail. It's the snake kind of vomiting itself up. Right? It's the creation of something, not quite out of nothing, but out of historical durée, out of Dasein. So you might want to say then, and this is an interesting way, a Heideggerian way of reading hermeneutics, is that his problem with science is that, like Heidegger, Gadamer believes that science discloses beings with a small b and an s at the end, whereas hermeneutics discloses being, capital B, with no s at the end, because that's the realm of the truly human. When you have completely absorbed your entire cultural tradition, that is the realm of Dasein. That is the realm of being. Language and being perfectly overlap then. So we never quite get to that point, but every one of us at any given moment in historical time, we're living somewhere, we're in Dasein, and our job is to make the most of our horizon by reconnecting ourselves to that historical horizon of our culture, and that means the constant ongoing process of reinterpretation. Very, very deep interpretation of what knowledge is and how knowledge works. Now, language turns out to be the horizon of this hermeneutic ontology, and it turns out that Dasein is disclosed to us. The kind of being characteristic of human beings comes to us when we absorb human culture, right? When we perform this hermeneutic activity. And what's very important for us here is that these slippery rules have to be appreciated as an important contribution to the theory of knowledge. In other words, I would say Wittgenstein and Gadamer are two figures, rough contemporaries, Gadamer's a little bit younger, who are both concerned with showing that if we don't get perfectly rule-governed knowledge, in the sense that grammar is rule-governed, it does not follow then that we have gibberish or absolute relativism. What you can still have are degrees of certainty. Remember what Aristotle said? We do not ask more certainty from a discipline than it can possibly give. Well, he offers us that flexibility, that encyclopedism, and that willingness to look for commonalities where none had been seen before. So, I would be inclined to say that Gadamer is part of that attack on formalism and on method, which served the useful corrective function of reorienting our culture away from the impossible positivist paradigm of a unified science towards perhaps a unified linguistically based hermeneutics, right, which is a much more doable proposition, it would seem to me. Now, to sum up, let's look at what the most important influences of Gadamer have been and where this all leads to. In the first case, Gadamer wishes to achieve for us Bildung, which might be thought of as cultivation. Richard Rorty uses this idea as the goal, or borrows much from Gadamer in the process of constructing his conception of education and knowledge. In many respects, the pragmatic flexibility of Gadamer has many similarities to the tradition of American pragmatism. It's not hard to see why flexible Gadamer would be very attractive to flexible Rorty. Right? Because Rorty doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and get gibberish, but he doesn't want to insist that this, or he does want to insist that this positivist program of reducing all knowledge to physics just doesn't work. So much of Rorty's conception, postmodern conceptions of language and thought and the aims of education are borrowed from Gadamer's idea of Bildung, from this wirkungsgeschichtliches Bewusstsein. A second influence will be this idea of clarity. This has been very important as a way of holding together the idea of interpretation. The director and the actor and the psychoanalyst and the literary critic are all pursuing the same goal in different genres. A very interesting way of thinking about that. A nice way of pulling these ideas together. And I would say that on the whole, his greatest influence has been in a sort of historical aesthetics. And a final influence for Gadamer and this whole hermeneutic tradition, and this is one that is not often mentioned, but I noticed it when I was reading contemporary political philosophy the last couple of months, is that there's been a movement called communitarianism, which is an alternative to the rights-based political philosophy so characteristic of guys like Rawls or Dworkin or any of the current legal thinkers, or the most important mainstream legal thinkers. And communitarianism, here I'm thinking of people like Galston or Sandel. What they want to do is emphasize the embeddedness historically of human communities, emphasize the common good and the appropriation of agreed upon or consensually accepted historical traditions. So what the communitarians are doing is trying to drive us back to the reappropriation of our cultural traditions as a way of avoiding the sort of anomie and atomism of rights-based and rationalism of rights-based political theory. For that reason, much of the influence or the kind of inspiration for communitarian political theorizing has been derived from this hermeneutic tradition, because what the communitarians are going to say is that there are soft rules governing our obligations to political communities. We have rejected these rules or ignored these rules because we have been under the spell of positivism, or under scientistic thinking, which prevents us from accepting any but the hard, fast, grammatical type rules. So in political philosophy, particularly in this communitarian tendency, Gadamer figures very heavily. In historical aesthetics, Gadamer is of the greatest influence. And most importantly, Gadamer has been important because he offers us a new way out of the labyrinth of modernity or post-modernity, which brings together a great variety of relatively disparate influences and intellectual activities under the aegis of one unifying idea: clarity of interpretation.